In the quiet corridors of Briar Hill Medical Center, a prestigious but aging hospital nestled in the town of Elmridge, the year began with a whisper of unease. Patients were dying. More than usual, more than expected, and always suddenly. These weren't the terminal cases that often slipped quietly into the night, but patients recovering well, joking with nurses, or sitting up in bed with visitors the day before. A wave of subtle dread crept through the ICU and cardiac wing, where night nurses exchanged uneasy glances and whispered theories during their breaks. Most deaths were written off as complications, clots, strokes, unexpected cardiac arrests, but a few seasoned nurses sensed a pattern too chilling to voice. That was when a new nurse, Emmy Cole, quietly stepped into the storm. Dan Renner was the kind of nurse every family prayed would care for their loved one. Calm, competent, soft-spoken. He moved through the hospital like a ghost, leaving no emotional footprint, but his charting was flawless and his demeanor steady. He'd worked at more than a dozen hospitals in 20 years, always with glowing references, though often for short periods. Behind his neat scrubs and silver-rimmed glasses, Dan carried the weight of a fractured life. An abusive childhood in a rural Pennsylvania town, a failed stint in the Navy, a bitter divorce that separated him from his daughters. Those who worked closely with him sensed a sadness in his eyes but chalked it up to the toll of nursing. No one knew that sadness masked something much darker. Charles had found a quiet form of control in the chaos of hospital life, by playing God, deciding who would live and who would not. Emmy Cole, a 35-year-old nurse and single mother, joined Briar Hill after fleeing a toxic marriage and settling in Elmridge with her 2 daughters. She had been diagnosed with cardiomyopathy just months earlier, a condition that left her tired, breathless, and living on borrowed strength. But Emmy needed the job and the insurance, so she kept her diagnosis secret, working grueling night shifts to cover for her mounting bills. When she met Dan, she found him oddly comforting. He was kind to her children when they visited, brought her herbal teas, and sat quietly beside her during breaks. Their friendship grew in the quiet, dark hours of the ICU, where both sought refuge from their private pains. She never imagined the man she considered her closest friend at work was the very one silently killing their patients. By mid-year, Emmy couldn't shake the pattern. For patients in her care had died inexplicably within a month, all of them stable hours earlier. She began charting timelines, cross-referencing medications, noticing how Dan had been on shift each time. One death might be random, for we're not. One night, after a patient named Harold Dunley died just hours after joking with her about his grandchildren, Emmy looked over his chart. Everything seemed routine until she saw an unscheduled insulin dose, and signed, time-stamped during Dan's rounds. Her breath caught in her chest. She knew Harold wasn't diabetic. The pieces began to click into place. The sudden deaths, the undocumented injections, the way Dan always volunteered to care for the sicker patients, and how those patients rarely made it through the night. Haunted by what she suspected and terrified of what it could mean, Emmy reported her concerns to the hospital's risk manager, who was more interested in protecting Briar Hill's reputation than its patients. When the local police hesitated to act on what they called circumstantial evidence, Emmy took her fears to the county prosecutor. An investigator named Carl Menendez really listened, and opened a case. Working with the police, Emmy agreed to wear a wire. The recordings were risky. Dan was paranoid and private. But during one conversation at a late-night diner, as Emmy shakily steered the conversation toward the recent deaths, Dan muttered, "Sometimes, people don't suffer as much if it's quick. That's all." It wasn't a confession, but it was enough. The prosecutor ordered a subpoena of medical records and had toxicology reports from recent deaths rerun. What they found was chilling. Lab results confirmed Emmy's worst fears. Lethal doses of digoxin, a powerful heart medication, had been found in the systems of at least 10 patients who had never been prescribed it. In several others, insulin levels were dangerously high, again with no diabetic history. The evidence formed a grim mosaic of murder, stretching back years and implicating Dan in a spree that spanned half the hospitals in the tri-state area. Investigators traced his career. Job after job, resignation letters after near misses, and a trail of unexplained deaths that institutions had quietly swept under the rug to avoid lawsuits. Dan Renner, it turned out, had likely killed dozens, maybe hundreds, under the guise of care. When confronted with the evidence, he initially denied everything, then broke under pressure. In a chilling, flat-toned confession, he admitted to killing at least 40 patients. The real number, he added, was probably higher. "I lost count." The news hit Elmridge and the country like a thunderclap. The Angel of Death headlines screamed across screens. Patients' families wept on camera, reliving memories of sudden deaths they'd never questioned. A civil lawsuit was filed by a coalition of victims' families, naming Briar Hill Medical Center and other hospitals for negligence. The public was horrified to learn that Dan had slipped through the cracks at every institution, with red flags ignored, HR records sealed, and warnings silenced under the guise of avoiding liability. Hospitals had quietly let him go, passing the problem along like a hot coal. Nurses nationwide held vigils. At Briar Hill, staff cried openly in break rooms. Emmy, once terrified and unsure, became a hero. Interviews with national media followed, but so did fear that other Dan Renners were still out there, undetected. The courtroom was packed the day Dan Renner was sentenced. He stood with the same vacant expression he'd worn in the oar, showing no remorse as the judge read the charges. 40 counts of murder, tampering with medical records, and reckless endangerment. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms, with no possibility of parole. But the judge's words hit harder. "This court believes the number of victims may exceed 400. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Emmy sat in the front row, hands trembling in her lap, her heart condition now worsening under the weight of trauma. She had stopped a killer, yes, but not before he had stolen hundreds of lives, destroyed families, and shattered trust in an already fragile healthcare system. The story of Dan Renner and Emmy Cole forced a reckoning in the medical world. States passed new legislation mandating better tracking of healthcare professionals' records. Hospitals were required to report suspicious terminations to a national database. Medical boards were pressured to take disciplinary actions more seriously. And in nursing schools across the country, Emmy's story was taught as a case study, not just in malpractice but in moral courage. Still, the wounds remained. Families haunted by what could have been, hospitals scrambling to rebuild trust, and a system grappling with the question, how did this happen again and again? The answer was chilling in its simplicity, because no one wanted to believe that evil could wear scrubs and a gentle smile. Subscribe to the White Coat Crimes for more shocking true stories, medical crimes, medical mysteries, and the dark side of healthcare you were never meant to see.